Professor Olivetti here. Let's take a look at the resurrection using the historical critical method. What can we know about the resurrection using contemporary scientific and historical techniques? Okay, so we're working here with Abel's text, page 280 to 287. Did Jesus think he would expect to rise on the third day? It's a good question. Did Jesus, as he faced his death, and we've already said, he probably knew he was going to die when he went into Jerusalem and people were hailing him as the Messiah. Then he attacked the temple. If those things happened, then he probably knew he was going to die, because anyone would expect to die in that time if they did those things. When he goes into Jerusalem and they were hailing him as the king of the Jews, that is an act of treason in the Roman world. Caesar is the king of the whole Roman Empire. If Jesus is going in and people are saying he's king and he's like, yeah, I'm the king, guess what? He's going to die for that. That's what the Roman punishment for treason was. If you claimed you were a king in the Roman Empire and you weren't Caesar, you got crucified. That's one of the ways that the Romans maintained control over the large area that they did. They tolerated no treason. You could get crucified just for rumor of being involved in any kind of insurrectionist act. And so when Jesus rides into Jerusalem and the Jews are hailing him as the king of the Jews, guess what? Yeah, he knows he's going to die, right? But did he expect to rise? Did he expect to rise on the third day? Well, again, Jesus does seem to see himself as the fulfillment of the prophets and calls himself the Son of Man in the accounts that we have from him. He seems to defer the term Messiah and embrace the term Son of Man. Now, what happened to the Son of Man? In the Jewish writings, the Second Temple writings, these writings were they might have been about 200 years old in the time of Christ, and very popular among the Jewish devout. And Jesus would have known about them. And in these writings, right, the Son of Man, which is in the Bible, in the book of Daniel, but also in some of these writings that are non-canonical, these spiritual and religious writings that did not get included in the Jewish canon and included in, therefore, the Christian Bible, like First Enoch and the similitudes of Enoch. Now, actually, First Enoch is in the canon of the oldest national or state church in the world, and a Christian church in the world, and that is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is today actually the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the Eritrean Orthodox Church. So there is within the original Christian churches, the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, there is one group, one church, local church that does include Enoch in the canon, in the Bible. Sorry, I just always find that fascinating and interesting, and so it will not be part of the test material. But first, what is in First Enoch will, in as much as in First Enoch and the similitudes of Enoch, they do talk about the Son of Man being raised up to heaven after his death, and he's part of the eschatological judgment, the last day when everyone is judged. That's going to be the Son of Man who does that, or is at least involved in that. And so Jesus would have been familiar with these writings. And if he saw himself as the fulfillment of the prophets, if he saw himself as the Son of Man, then it would not be any stretch of the imagination. As a matter of fact, it would be quite practical to believe that he, therefore, may have also believed that he would be raised from the dead. So we've said, and Abba lays it out clearly, makes a very rational case that Jesus uh, likely would have thought or could have thought that he would be raised from the dead because it is part of the beliefs about the Son of Man. But now Abel takes up another question. Did Jesus actually rise from the dead? And he starts off looking at the scholarship, some of the writings of biblical scholars like uh, Luke Timothy Johnson, who in some ways downplay the historicity of the resurrection. Um, John Dominic Crossan is another one, kind of downplays it in some ways. So some scholars, and this is actually more Crossan than Johnson. Johnson kind of avoids the historical question and goes more into the meaning of it and how Christ was experienced by the early Christian communities and experienced today. But Crossan is an example of a scholar who takes risen from the dead rather symbolically, right? So some of these scholars say things like it's just an analogy for the way Christians experience the Spirit of Jesus among them. They really experience Christ present there with them, and they explain this as Christ being risen from the dead, like he's back, he's with us, right? Or some scholars might think that was a later invention, right? That early Christians did have visions of Jesus, but then those visions got shared in a kind of telephone exchange where one person says something and they change it slightly and then someone else changes something slightly. Maybe that kind of got exaggerated and turned into these accounts of the experience of a resurrected body. That they were, that really someone just had a vision, but then that got turned into, hey, no, it was real. They actually touched him, as the story got slightly exaggerated. Or it could just be a belief that was in keeping with the beliefs of the time, that they're just saying, well, his spirit rose into heaven, so he's alive in heaven, but not necessarily reflective of a historical occurrence where the disciples are actually touching the glorified body in the way that it's described in the scriptures. Now, the first thing Abel points out, and he relies heavily on the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright for this. I don't know why all the Old Testament scholars have two first, it's always their first and second name or initials. Must be a thing. I don't know. If you want to be one, maybe, a famous one, maybe put your, use three names like they all seem to use. Anyway, the Greek words used by the early Christians are very specific, right? They're not talking about the general resurrection of a spirit, as was a popular belief in the time. They're not talking about a vision. They had different words for those things, right? The words that they're using, the language that's used in the Greek in the Gospels and in other parts of the New Testament, are very specific. They're very specifically talking about a person who has a physical resurrection of some sort after being dead, right? So the argument Wright makes, and that Abel seems to agree with, is that if they meant any of these things, right, if they're just making an analogy or talking about visions, right, or talking about the resurrection of the spirit, and it's going to be with God, or have union with God in the typical way that people believed in that time, well, typical way that some people believed in that time, then they would have used the words that were used to describe these things. But these words, anastasis, right, anastemi, ergo, or igero, right, they are not saying that. They are saying this is a resurrection that involves a bodily, sensible, tangible component. In other words, the Greek terms that they're using, they're not referring to a resuscitated corpse. They're not saying, hey, this was the body and the same body came back, because there is instances of that in the gospel, right? Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. That's not talked about the same way that the resurrected body of Jesus is talked about. They don't refer to a spirit, a ghost, or a vision. Again, they had other specific words that they used to describe those things, and that's not the way the resurrected Christ is described in the Gospels. Right? What does it describe? Well, it describes a deceased person who has been raised from the dead and transformed. Right? Again, remember, it's not the same body. It's the same, but it's also different. It's transformed. Right? So the risen Christ is not easily recognized at first. He's described as glowing white, and he appears and disappears. He's not bound by time and space. Yet, though, what? They can touch him. He eats food. There is a tangible and bodily component. So let's talk a little bit about what people believed about the afterlife during the time of Jesus. The Greco-Roman view of the afterlife was nothing like the glorified body of the risen Christ in the Gospels. The Greco-Roman rule was understanding was that you would go like to some place like Hades under the earth, Tartarus, which was not a nice place, or the Isle of the Blessed, but it's all just going someplace else. There's none of this coming back to the earth in the popular understanding of the afterlife in the Greco-Roman tradition. Jewish belief in the afterlife were varied at this time. The Sadducees, they didn't believe in the resurrection. They thought you died and that's it. And in the more ancient Jewish writings in the Bible, we do see this. After people die, they go to a place called Sheol, which is just existence in some kind of vague holding pattern. There's not really any individual consciousness or anything. You just kind of cease to exist. So there's really no afterlife or resurrection for the Sadducees, who base their beliefs on the oldest Jewish beliefs that we find in scriptures. The Jewish philosopher Philo, who was influenced by Greek culture, believed that there was a soul without a body, so that the soul resurrected and the body just decomposed, similar to probably what many people believe today. In Second Maccabees, and we do see the idea of a bodily resurrection taking place. The Pharisees also seem to believe in this during the time of Jesus. Again, what was this body like? It wasn't necessarily the same body. People, didn't have specific description of it. It could be interpreted in different ways, but they did believe in a resurrection of some sorts. When was this supposed to happen, though? This would take place for everybody who gets resurrected. It wasn't necessarily everybody, but it would happen on the last day, the eschatological day of judgment, right? So everyone would kind of would die, and maybe their spirits were resurrected at that time, but you wouldn't have a bodily resurrection until the end of time, the last day. Then everybody's bodies would be resurrected in some form, and you would go to be with God. If you were resurrected and you were judged to be appropriate for that end, without getting too specific about it. And there's a lot of different cultural ideas from different cultures, like Zoroastrianism and the Persian culture, and other ancient Near Eastern cultures that play into this idea that was held by the Pharisees and a lot of the Jews during the time of Jesus. However, all these ideas are not the same. All these popular ideas of the time are different from what the early Christians believed about the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, first of all, it's different from the typical Jewish belief because Jesus was not waiting for the last day to be resurrected. They thought he had resurrected on the third day, right? Which is a kind of colloquialism for like not long in the Jewish terms of speech. So it wasn't this one. It wasn't they were saying, oh yeah, this is everybody's going to get resurrected on the last day. We'll all be raised up on the day of judgment, right? Which is still a popular belief, still the belief in Christianity today, mainstream Christianity today, and Islam today. That's not it. It's something different. He is risen from the dead with his glorified body, now. They're saying it's not a way. So it's something different again. Something different from the typical beliefs. Also, the resurrected body, notice, was a transformed body. And this is something that also seems kind of unique. Right? Again, the body wasn't exactly the same. Jesus' body wasn't the same as before, but it wasn't completely different, right? So it's not exactly the same. They recognize it kind of when their eyes are open, but not at first. It suddenly appears and disappears. St. Paul calls it a spiritual body. So it's kind of more spiritual in nature than physical. However, it does have physical manifestations. It can be touched and it eats. This is unique. You don't see this in the beliefs of the time. You didn't see it with the Jewish tradition or the Greek tradition. So can the resurrection be studied historically? Let's just look and say, is this even something we can do? Right? Remember we studied, we said like the divinity of Christ, you can't really study using the historical critical method. The humanity of Christ, yeah, we can find out about Christ, about his humanity, including what his humanity might have thought about his divinity, right? Anyway, this is a similar question. Can we even study this historically? Right? It does seem to be a divine act. He is risen from the dead. Luke Timothy Johnson says no, not really, right? Because when he's resurrected, he's not part of the world of history anymore because he transcends time and space. He's like beyond that. One way some people sometimes talk about it is when he was resurrected, right? He went everywhere. So he's in all time. He's in all space. You can't really say, oh, okay, let's talk about him in a historical context. Let's talk about the resurrected Christ in a specific time and place because he transcends that. So it's not really an appropriate method. But Luke Timothy Johnson will say there was an experience. What we do have historically is that we can say that the real human community, right, of the early Christians, they did experience the risen Christ. And they did claim that he was risen from the dead. And that changed their lives. That experience changed their lives and also changed the lives of people today. It also guides people today. So he says that's what's important about the risen Christ. And that's really what we should be spending our time looking at, not trying to analyze it historically. He finds that inappropriate. Albo, on the other hand, is more than willing to look at the resurrection as a historical event and see what we can know about it historically. And he starts by looking at the two claims of early Christians. He says, well, okay, he agrees with Johnson that we have this claim of the historical Christians, that they really did believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. They had an experience that caused them to believe that, and it changed the way they lived their lives. It moved them to action, right? Just like it does for people today. So Abel says, okay, let's look at the beliefs of those early Christians. And he starts with the claim that the tomb was empty. Now, this is in all the Gospels. So it looks like it has so people say, hey, it's in every Gospel, that therefore there's a better chance that it's an actual event because you have more documentation or more reports of it. Second of all, we look at one of the other methods we use in the historical critical method, embarrassment, right? Abel points out that the stories in the Gospels, these multiple attestations, have the women going to the tomb, finding it empty, and then having that experience of some kind of angelic beings telling them that Christ has risen from the dead. So that empty tomb is an important part of the claims. It's really what opens the whole resurrection question up and opens people's minds to the possibility of it, and then later the experience of it. So Abel says, like, why would they make up a story in which such an important element, finding the empty tomb, was witnessed by women when, and sorry women and men, sorry humans, when in that time women were not seen as legitimate or as legitimate legal witnesses. Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry, but that seems to be a fact of the times, that women's witness was not court-worthy because women were not as valued as men. So that's the argument. In other words, this part of the story was not made up, because if it was made up, they would have made up a better story. They would have had some reputable men who would be well believed witnesses, right, to find the empty tomb, not these women. And even Luke reflects this. When he has the women come back, what do the men say? Oh, that's nonsense, right? They don't believe him. That, unfortunately, right, could have been a popular occurrence in that time. So there we have, you understand what I'm saying with the embarrassment clause. If they made the story up, they would have made it up better. They wouldn't have made women be the witnesses of the empty tomb. They would have made it some reputable man or men. And therefore, Abel makes a good point here, I think, that makes that more likely to be a historical event. The second claim is that Jesus appeared to many eyewitnesses in a transformed bodily state. Right? We have these accounts in all the Gospels, and it talks about it in the rest of the New Testament. And he says, well, what can we do? He says there's three options for this. Number one, he says it's an historical event. Right? The people saw, touched the glorified body of Christ historically, right? literalistly, right? Like this is actually this was a historical fact. This actually happened. If you had a video camera, you went back in time, you would be able to record this on your phone. That's number one. This was a historical event. This was something that actually happened. Option number two is fabrication. Somebody made it up. Nothing like it happened. Just somehow people told the story and other people started believing it. And then there you go. A lie might be a strong word to use, but it was somehow made up. It was not a historical event. Or number three, he says, they had some kind of visions. The disciples had visions or hallucinations, and they were just visions or hallucinations, but they believed that they were real bodily appearances. And he says it has to be one. These are the three options. Now, I mean, first of all, I'm not trying to disable here or Abel here, but again, to me, when someone says there's three options, this, or this, or there's two options, this or that, I always get a little bit suspicious and say, really, is that all there is? It could only be one of those three things. So the line of reasoning he's using here to me is immediately suspect. Now, what Abel says is he goes back to the point where the description of the risen Christ doesn't fit with the beliefs of the time about a resurrection. In other words, it's not a fabrication. He says this is not something people made up, right? Because if they made it up, they wouldn't have made up something so weird, right? They would have made up something that fit with what people believed at the time. It's a rational point he's making, right? However, it's not necessarily true, right? Why couldn't people make up some strange new idea? I mean, people do it. It does happen sometimes. All right, the second point, vision he makes, is he says visions or hallucinations were highly implausible because the gospel accounts are designed to rule out that explanation that these events were merely visions or appearances of Jesus Christ, right? So he says, again, they weren't just visions or hallucinations because when the people were describing them, they were specifically describing them in a way to say, hey, these aren't visions or hallucinations. We actually touched him. He actually ate food, right? And so he says, hey, if it wasn't made up and if it wasn't just a vision that was misunderstood as a real bodily appearance, then it must be a historical event, right? Because remember, he said you only have three options, this one, or this one. And if it's not this one or this one, then it must be this one. Okay, Abel. What he's saying is not irrational, right? He's following a good line of reason. However, I do think he's coming with a little prejudice here. So here in this orange type is my critique of Abel. So first thing he says is like, it couldn't be a vision or it wasn't fabricated because it doesn't match up with a way that people would talk about resurrection at the time. Well, what if they had a vision, right? That inspired them to think about the resurrection in some new way. Then couldn't they have shared their new vision with others? And then become some new way to talk about a resurrection experience? Or, what if they hallucinated touching and seeing the resurrected body? And so the way that their vision or hallucination led them to believe that there was actually a tangible body there, right? So what if they actually thought that it really happened? Then wouldn't they report it that way, right? And share it with people that way? Now, I realize this brings up a whole larger question of what does it mean to experience something? I mean, if 3 or 4 people have the same hallucination, Did it really happen for those 3 or 4 people? Is it real? Right? Or is that a hallucination because maybe, another 3 or 4 people that were there didn't see it or didn't experience it, didn't have that same experience. This is really bring up the question of the subjective and objective nature of reality. But we're not going to go too far into that. But what I'm just going to say is, I think I would agree be more in the camp of Luke Timothy Johnson that no, you really can't study this using the historical critical method. We really can't say, well, they must have actually touched this glorified body, right? For the reasons Abel says, that's not an option. So though I respect Abel's opinion here, I think he is kind of being a little bit prejudiced on the side of believing it, right? If he's going to say, let's reserve ourselves to using the historical critical method, right? So you see both, Wright, Abel, Luke Timothy Johnson, they all believe in the resurrection of Christ. But Luke Timothy Johnson doesn't think it's something that can be studied by the historical critical method. Abel seems to think it does, but I got to be a little bit critical of him here and saying, I think that he's kind of using some faulty logic, right? There is more than 3 options. It's not just this, or it has to be this. So if we can't, again, it seems to be one of those things that really is divine in nature, and therefore we can't really study it using contemporary scientific methods or the historical critical method. The resurrection of Christ was an experience that they had. So here's the way I would sum it up. We can't tell the exact nature of the early Christians' experience of the risen Christ using the historical critical method, but we can see that they did have an experience, right? Something happened. They experienced the risen Christ in some weird, profound way. If we start off, what do we see after the crucifixion? They're hiding, they're running away, right? They are not enthusiastic about Jesus. Matter of fact, they're scared that they're going to get in trouble for being associates of Jesus. And we see in Luke the disciples running away to Emmaus, right? Then, while they're sitting there hiding or running away, all of a sudden things turn around. And they suddenly start going out into the street, proclaiming the resurrection of Christ publicly. And they sell all they have, and they form this new community based on their beliefs in the risen Christ. And again, they're publicly proclaiming Christ rose from the dead, and they're changing the whole way they live their lives. So something happened. They had an experience of the risen Christ. And it wasn't something mundane. It seemed to be something profound. Something strange and life-changing happened. And I think that's about all we can really say using the historical critical method. I think if we try to comment more than that, then we're overreaching. And we're not doing this based on the historical critical method anymore. We're going into faith. We're going to what we believe, which is great for our beliefs, but we have to recognize, right? Again, going back to the difference between faith and science, right? Science and the historical critical method is a kind of scientific method. It can tell us about the things that are tangible, the things that are sensible, the things we can hear, right? It can tell us about the things that we can sense with our senses. But it can't tell us about things that we might know in some subtle ways, right? So again, our faith should be supported by reason and should not be contrary to reason. But part of that is not overstepping the bounds of reason either, and being honest when something like the nature of the experience of the risen Christ is a matter of faith. It's something that they experience for themselves, and it's something on some level, if we believe it, we take their word, but we also have our own personal experience. So it's not like a math fact we can prove, but it's something more profound than that, because it's a belief that we're invited to believe in and we're invited to experience for ourselves.